Now let me go to the next topic. The Tubbataha disaster. The Tubbataha Reef in Philippine territory has been proclaimed a UN World Heritage Site. This honor and distinction is very rarely given to a particular tourist or resort site. And yet, in Palawan, Tubbataha Reef has been 600 species of fish, 360 species of corals, 11 species of sharks, 13 species of dolphins and whales, and 100 species of birds and sea turtles. This magical spot within Philippine territory is governed by Philippine law, Republic Act number 10067, or the Tubbataha Reef Park Act of 2009. Last month, on January 17, the USS Guardian, a U.S. Navy minesweeper, in other words, a warship, passed by the marine sanctuary. It is said that park rangers radioed the ship with advice that it was nearing the reef. Malapit na kayo, baka mauntog ninyo itong aming reef. However, the ship captain allegedly insisted that the park rangers should instead raise their complaint to the U.S. Embassy. Ito na mga Amerikano, oo, para bang hindi mo sila naging classmate sa Amerika. Gusto mo, sasabihin ka na baka matangkil mo yung reef dahil malapit ka na, takutin niya, kayabang-yabang, mag-complain ka sa US Embassy. Doon siya sa Palawan, pero pinaparefer niya sa US Embassy. Isn't that a height of arrogance that they are not entitled to? For your information, they can speak English with their American accent. That is all they're capable of. Alam mo, galit lang tayo sa mga professor natin, hindi na pinapamemorize tayo. Of course, since I'd already been a lawyer, I was already a lawyer, and I'd already been a graduate of UP Law. I went to take my graduate degrees there, and the first time I stood up, I memorized the entire case, and the entire class was astounded and left me and remained behind after class to say, "Where did you get that talent?" And I said, "In my country, it's not a talent. Everybody memorizes." You're kidding. No. Everyone in the Philippines memorizes books. And they couldn't believe their ears. Oh, yan ang Amerikano na sinabihan mo ng baka malapit ka na. Sabi niya, magreklamo ka doon sa US Embassy. Yabang naman itong Amerikano na ito. Yun lang, dahil matangkad sila. Ang importante dyan ay, kamukha ng Immigration Commissioner ako. Ang lahat ng cyber agents hinuhuli namin, mas mataas sa akin, pinipresenta sa akin. Natural, kung tatayo kaming dalawa, mas mataas sila. Yeah, the first thing that I did always was, sit down! According to the official statement of the Tubbataha Management Office, the U.S. ship did not have a permit to enter the park, which is a marine protected area. It was also found that the vessel did not inform the marine park rangers of its presence and situation, which is normally expected. When the rangers informed the Americans of their violations, and the rangers announced intention to board the vessel, the radio contact remained unanswered. Di tayo pinansin. And the boarding protocol was aborted, especially since the Filipinos saw the Americans taking positions armed with weapons. Trigger happy itong Amerikano. Under Philippine law, the American warship violated the provision on unauthorized entry, damages to the reef, non-payment of conservation fees, destroying and disturbing resources, and obstruction of law enforcement officers. The American vessel directly caused environmental disaster over an area of some 4,000 square meters, which is the size of some 10 basketball courts. Under Philippine law, the U.S. Navy is the duty to pay a fine pa lang ha, of $300 or some 12,000 pesos per square meter, plus another $300 per square meter for rehabilitation efforts. Akala nila yung lang dapat nilang bayaran. The American crew were transferred to support vessels, but the warship, which is 68 meters long, is still there. Under the U.S. Navy salvage operation plan, the ship will eventually be broken down into pieces and taken away. But while it is there, it will continue to destroy marine life. It was an unspeakable crime to inflict such damage on our reef. The only defense of the Americans is that they allegedly used a faulty map that misplaced the location of the reef. Pero mo na kahit technology society sila, meron silang pagbumuka magsabi, nagkamali kasi kami eh. Mali ang mapa namin. This is the high-tech society. Mali ang mapa nila. Ba't nagbibenta ba ng mali na mapa? At bakit sa lahat ng klaseng mapa, yung pang pinakamali ang pinapili nila. In other words, the Americans admit that they were sloppy with their map and that they were arrogant with the Filipino park rangers whose advice they disregarded. On February 4, the American ambassador reiterated regrets over the incident and assured our Foreign Affairs Secretary that the United States will provide appropriate compensation. Tama na ba yun?
No!
What is your basis for saying no? Kailangan nagbasa ka. Here it is. As a student of international law, I find that the statement issued by the U.S. ambassador is disturbing and amounts to double speak, speaking from both sides of the mouth. The statement calls the Tubbataha event as an accident. The word accident implies that the act of the U.S. ship involved no negligence and no fault. Furthermore, the U.S. government has offered other forms of assistance. Thus, in my view, the statement issued by the U.S. Embassy makes American compensation and other activities look like foreign assistance for which we Filipinos are expected to feel grateful. Gee, thanks for bumping into our reef. In other words, I'm concerned that the American offer of compensation is made to appear not as a dictate of legal obligation under international law, but as an indulgence in American magnanimity. Yun ang problema natin. Hindi nila inaamin na may kasalanan sila. Sila na may kasalanan, tayo ngayon ang magpasalamat sa kanila. Yun ang magiging epekto ng kanyang diplomaties. If the Philippine government resorts to the legal process to demand compensation, on record, the Americans could have evaded any admission of guilt. Biro mo, pareho naman lingwahe natin, gaganong-ganunin nila tayo para bang kakaintindi ng Ingles. Instead, the Americans could oppose any complaint in an international law tribunal by raising the defense of sovereign immunity from suit. Sovereign immunity, my foot. Allow me to make a simple analysis of the international law dimensions of the Tubbataha event. There is no question that Tubbataha near Palawan is part of Philippine territory, protected not only by Philippine law, but also by the UN Declaration that it is a World Heritage Site. When the American warship ran aground in the reef, the U.S. government committed what internationally calls an, quote, internationally wrongful act. This is a word of art. This is a term of art in international law. It was an internationally wrongful act to allow that warship to run aground and thus destroy our reef. As such, the Tubbataha event is a violation of the international law codified under the topic of, quote, responsibility of states for internationally wrongful acts, unquote, issued by the International Law Commission. May kasalanan sila. May batas eh. Alam mo, international law is a very complicated field of law because kung criminal law ka, pumunta ka lang sa criminal law natin known as the penal code. Kung civil lawyer ka, pumunta ka lang sa civil code. Kung constitutionalist ka, pumunta ka lang sa constitution. Yan na lahat. Pero ang international law, walang libro. Ito lang ang one of the very rare cases we're very fortunate that there is a codification of international law on the topic of responsibility of states for internationally wrongful acts. Under this topic, the Tubbataha event is covered by at least 2 articles. Under Article 1, and I'm quoting, every internationally wrongful act of a state entails the international responsibility of the state. Under Article 2, again I'm quoting, there is an internationally wrongful act of a state when conduct consisting of an action or omission, letter A, is attributable to the state under international law, and B, constitutes a breach of an international obligation of the state. Therefore, as provided by the International Law Commission, under the principle of attribution, the conduct of the officials and personnel of the USS Guardian is considered as an act of the U.S. government under international law, and consequently, the U.S. government bears responsibility. Aminin nila ang kasalanan nila at maghingi sila ng dispensa. Hindi na, sorry lang ha, hindi naman namin sadya sadya din nyo, kasi sinabihan na kayong lumayo kayo, ayaw nyo The International Law Commission is one authority. Let me cite another authority, Sir Ian Brownlee, Oxford Professor Emeritus of Public International Law. The latest 7th edition of his famous book, Principles of Public International Law, was published in 2008. By 2009, Professor Brownlee had passed away, and the 8th edition of his book was issued by Professor James Crawford in 2012. According to Brownlee, and I'm quoting, in principle, an act or omission which is on its face a breach of legal obligation gives rise to responsibility in international law. Hindi ba? Your freedom ends where my nose begins. Kaya kung nag-westra ka, lumayo ka sa ilong ko dahil pag natangkil mo yan, you're responsible for the consequences of your action. Ganun din sa international law. Gala ka ng gala, nabangga ka doon sa pag-aari ng Pilipinas. Di may kasalanan ka. It has given rise to responsibility. The practice of states and the jurisprudence of arbitral tribunals in the international court have followed the theory of objective responsibility as a general principle. What this means is that, under the principle of objective responsibility, a breach of international obligation occurs by result alone. Ang resulta lang, titingnan natin, even in the absence of negligence or fault. Hindi natin kailangan mag-usapan if there was negligence or there was fault, because the U.S. Embassy will of course deny either one of these factors. Pero under the principle of objective responsibility, may pananagutan siya sa resulta. Nasira ang ating brief. Paano mo man-restore yan? Sabi ng iba, it will take 250 years to restore it to its original condition. Kaya, I'll give you a little tip. Pag nabangga ang sasakyan mo, sabihin mo sa driver ng other vehicle, ibalik mo ang kotse ko, parang hindi nabangga. Ganun yun. Kaya, covered ka na dyan. Papirmahin mo. I will restore this vehicle to its condition prior to the collision. Ganon din dapat sa Tubbataha. Let the Americans assume responsibility for a breach of an international obligation. Let them put Tubbataha Reef right into its very condition upon collision with that warship. We will not settle for anything less. Bibigay-bigay sila ng pera at the other forms of assistance. That reef is priceless. It is the heritage of everyone. Let me go on to my third authority, the time-honored decision in the 1927 case of Tubbataha Factory. In its decision, the Permanent Court of International Justice said, and I quote, "It is a principle of international law that the breach of an international engagement involves an obligation to make reparation in an adequate form." Reparation means ibalik mo siya sa dati. Reparation, therefore, is the indispensable complement of a failure to apply a convention. It is a principle of international law that any breach of an engagement involves an obligation to make reparation ibalik mo ang aming reef sa dati niyang pinatatayuan na parang hindi mo siya nabangga. Yun ang dapat yan. Finally, let me cite one more authority, the RPUS Visiting Forces Agreement, for which I have for many years appealed to my colleagues to repeal. Article 2 on respect for law. Article 2 provides, quote, it is the duty of U.S. personnel to respect the laws of the Republic of the Philippines. The government of the United States shall take all measures within its authority to ensure that this is done. Oh, ano ngayon masasabi ng mga pro-BFA? Paano mo ngayon mapasagot ang Amerika? Ayaw niya ng BFA. Ayaw natin ng BFA, sila gusto nila. Ngayon, let them enforce it against the Americans. Tingnan natin kung may magawa sila. In sum, international law is clear that whether or not there was negligence or fault on the part of the U.S. warship, under the principle of state responsibility, the U.S. government is responsible for the partial destruction of the Tubbataha reef, which some say will need 250 years to be fully restored. Under the principle of objective responsibility, the basic test is whether there has been a breach of international obligation. The U.S. has accepted it has committed such a breach. Therefore, the U.S. government should stop referring to the Tubbataha event as an accident. For me, these are fighting words. Tawagin mo accident yan, na tinawagan ka na para maiwasan mo. Sinabihan mo, doon silang magreklamo sa U.S. Embassy sa Manila, doon ka sa Palawan. So that's why in constitutional law terms, I would call them fighting words. Yung ginigirat mo na po niyan. Instead, the Tubbataha event should be called a breach of international obligation. I now mercifully come to my conclusion. I share one unbreakable linkage with you. At one time, I was your age, and like all UP students, I wanted to change the world. Maybe I have. But the world also changed me. Now I'm old enough to have seen the world and have all my illusions shattered. Am I disillusioned? No. No, because as the poet said, you're familiar with this poem. Ulysses is going home. He has grown old, attempting to go home because he's been under a spell for decades. Now Ulysses is talking to himself. He's an old man. Though much is taken, much abides, and though we are not now that strength which in old days moved earth and heaven, that which we are, one equal temper of heroic hearts, made weak by time and fate, but strong in will, to strive, to seek, to find, and never to heal. Thank you very much.